Ate Mother Bear built cable car system to help. Baby reach sick grandmother. Everyone was in tears. Before moving into the story, let us know where you're watching from and don't forget to like and subscribe. The morning mist rolled through the valley like a living thing. Cold fingers of fog reaching between the ancient pine trees that stood like silent guardians along the mountain ridge. Ethan Marshall adjusted the weight of his camera bag on his shoulder, his breath forming small clouds in the crisp autumn air that carried the scent of damp earth and fallen leaves. He had been walking for 3 hours now, following a path that existed more in his mind than on any map, drawn deeper into the wilderness by something he couldn't quite name. It wasn't just the promise of untouched landscapes for his photography portfolio that pulled him forward, though he told himself that was the reason. No, there was something else. Something about the way the forest seemed to whisper secrets in the rustling of its leaves, the way shadows danced between the trees, as if hiding stories meant only for those brave enough to venture this far from civilization. His boots crunched softly on the carpet of pine needles beneath his feet, each step taking him further from the world he knew. The world where his apartment sat empty except for the photographs on the walls, images of wildlife frozen in time, captured in moments of pure existence. Those photographs used to bring him joy, used to remind him why he picked up a camera in the first place, but lately they felt hollow, like echoes of something he had lost along the way. Maybe that's why he was here, in this remote valley that the locals in the small mountain town had warned him about. Not with tales of danger, but with something else in their eyes, something that looked almost like reverence mixed with confusion. They spoke of strange sounds in the night, of trees that seemed to move when no wind blew, of bears that behaved in ways that defied everything anyone knew about wildlife behavior. The sound came to him first as a distant rhythm, so faint he thought it might be his imagination playing tricks after hours of solitude. It was a creaking, methodical and steady, like the sound of an old rocking chair on a wooden porch. But there were no porches here, no chairs, nothing but wilderness for miles in every direction. Ethan stopped, tilting his head to listen better, his photographer's instinct for finding the unusual suddenly alert and focused. The sound continued, neither growing louder nor fading away, maintaining its steady rhythm like a heartbeat of the forest itself. He checked his compass, noting his position carefully before leaving the faint trail he had been following, moving instead toward the source of that mysterious sound. The trees grew denser as he moved off the path, their branches intertwining overhead to create a canopy so thick that the morning light filtered through in scattered beams, painting the forest floor in patches of gold and shadow. Spiderwebs decorated with morning dew sparkled like diamonds strung between the branches, and somewhere in the distance, a woodpecker hammered its morning rhythm against a hollow trunk. But underneath all these normal forest sounds, that strange creaking persisted, growing slightly louder now, enough that Ethan could tell he was moving in the right direction. His camera hung around his neck, ready, though he had no idea what he expected to find. Perhaps some old mining equipment left behind from the gold rush days, slowly being reclaimed by the forest. Perhaps a tree rubbing against another in just the right way to create that rhythmic sound. What he found instead stopped him in his tracks, his breath catching in his throat as his mind struggled to process what his eyes were seeing. Stretching across a chasm that had to be at least 40 feet wide was something that simply shouldn't exist. At first glance, it looked like a massive spider web made of vines and branches, but as Ethan's eyes adjusted to the strange sight, he realized it was far more complex than that. Thick vines, some as wide as his arm, were woven together with smaller branches and what looked like strips of bark, creating a network of supports that spanned the entire gap between two massive pine trees on either side of the chasm. The construction was intricate, deliberate, with crossbeams and supports that reminded him of the cable bridges he had seen in remote parts of South America, except this was made entirely from forest materials. The creaking sound was coming from this structure, from the way it swayed slightly in the breeze, the vines rubbing against each other in a rhythm that was almost hypnotic. Ethan moved closer, his photographer's eye taking in every detail, even as his rational mind rebelled against what he was seeing. The weaving pattern was too precise to be natural, too purposeful to be accidental. Where the vines connected to the trees, they were secured with what looked like knots, actual knots, tied in ways that would distribute weight evenly. There were even what appeared to be pulleys made from curved branches, smoothed by wear, with vines running through them. His hands trembled slightly as he raised his camera, the weight of it familiar and grounding as he began to document this impossible discovery. Through his lens, the details became even more incredible. He could see where newer vines had been woven in to repair older sections, where the bark had been worn smooth by repeated use, where smaller branches had been carefully selected and placed to create what looked almost like a track or a guide rail. The sound of breaking twigs behind him made Ethan freeze, his finger hovering over the shutter button. Slowly, carefully, he lowered himself behind a fallen log, his heart pounding so hard he was sure whatever was approaching would hear it. The footsteps were heavy, deliberate, and accompanied by a low, huffing sound that Ethan recognized immediately. Bears. His mind raced through everything he knew about bear safety, about making noise to avoid surprising them, about never getting between a mother and her cubs. But something made him stay hidden, some instinct that told him he needed to see what would happen next. The mother bear emerged from the undergrowth first, and even from his hiding spot 20 yards away. Ethan could see she was magnificent. Her dark fur caught the filtered sunlight, revealing hints of brown and gold underneath the black. She moved with the confident grace of an apex predator, but there was something different about her gait, something purposeful that went beyond the normal foraging behavior he had photographed dozens of times before. Behind her, staying close to her flank, was a cub, probably born that spring, judging by its size. The little one's fur was fluffier than its mother's, and it moved with the slightly clumsy enthusiasm of youth, occasionally stopping to sniff at interesting rocks or plants before hurrying to catch up. What happened next challenged everything Ethan thought he knew about wildlife. The mother bear approached the vine structure not with curiosity or caution, but with familiarity. She knew exactly where she was going, exactly what she was doing. She moved to a specific spot near the base of one of the anchor trees and began to pull on a particular vine with her teeth and claws. The entire structure responded, creaking louder as something began to move along those guide rails Ethan had noticed. A basket, woven from branches and reinforced with mud and leaves, emerged from where it had been hidden among the foliage on their side of the chasm. It was large enough to hold. Ethan's mind completed the thought even as he watched it happen. Large enough to hold a bear cub. The mother bear made a series of soft grunting sounds to her cub, who approached the basket with obvious reluctance. The little one circled it several times, sniffing cautiously, occasionally looking back at its mother as if asking whether this was really necessary. The mother's patience was remarkable. She didn't force or rush, instead demonstrating by placing her own paw in the basket, then removing it, showing it was safe. She nosed the basket gently, made more encouraging sounds, and even placed some berries she had been carrying in her mouth into the bottom of it, creating an incentive for the nervous cub to climb inside. It took nearly 15 minutes of coaxing, but finally the cub climbed into the basket, its small body barely fitting, testament to how precisely the basket had been sized. The mother bear immediately moved to another position, wrapping her powerful arms around a different section of the vine network. What followed was a display of engineering understanding that made Ethan's hands shake as he tried to keep his camera steady. The mother bear began to pull in a specific sequence, using her own body weight as a counterbalance. The basket with the cub inside began to move along the guide rails, sliding out over the chasm. The cub let out a small whimper of fear, and the mother made a reassuring sound in response, never breaking her rhythm as she continued to work the primitive pulley system. Ethan watched in absolute awe as the basket traveled across the 40-foot gap, the mother bear's muscles straining with effort, but her movements remaining controlled and precise. She was essentially operating a manual cable car system, one that she clearly understood at a mechanical level that should have been impossible for an animal. When the basket reached the other side, it settled onto what Ethan now realized was a receiving platform, another carefully constructed area of woven branches that cradled the basket securely. The cub climbed out quickly, visible as a small dark shape on the far side of the chasm, and let out a call to its mother. The mother bear's response was immediate. She began working the vines again, this time bringing the empty basket back across the chasm. The entire process was reversed, and Ethan realized with growing amazement that this wasn't a one-time crossing. This was a regular route, a constructed pathway across an otherwise impassable obstacle. When the basket returned to the near side, the mother bear did something that made Ethan's breath catch again. She looked directly at his hiding spot, her dark eyes meeting his through the foliage. For a moment, neither moved. Ethan's finger remained frozen on his camera's shutter button, his heart hammering in his chest. The bear's gaze wasn't aggressive or surprised. It was knowing, as if she had been aware of his presence all along and had chosen to proceed anyway. Then, as calmly as she had arrived, the mother bear turned and made her own way around the chasm, disappearing into the undergrowth to take what was clearly a longer but more conventional route to reunite with her cub. Ethan remained hidden for another 10 minutes, his mind reeling from what he had witnessed. When he finally emerged from his hiding spot, his legs were stiff and his hands were still trembling. But his camera's memory card contained evidence of something extraordinary. He approached the vine structure again, this time able to examine it more closely without the fear of disturbing the bears. The construction was even more remarkable up close. He could see where different types of vines had been selected for different purposes, some for flexibility, others for strength. The knots were varied too, some designed to be permanent, others clearly meant to be adjusted. There were wear patterns that suggested this system had been in use for months, maybe even years. But the most incredible detail was something he noticed only when he looked at the base of the anchor trees. There were marks in the bark, deliberate scratches that formed patterns. They weren't random claw marks from climbing. They looked almost like instructions, like a diagram. As the sun climbed higher and the morning mist began to burn away, Ethan set up his equipment for a longer observation period. He found a concealed spot with a good view of both the cable car system and the approaches to it, settling in with his telephoto lens and notebook. His original plan to photograph landscapes was forgotten. This was something far more important, far more incredible. He had stumbled upon evidence of problem-solving and tool use in bears that went beyond anything in the scientific literature. But more than that, he had witnessed something that spoke to a deeper intelligence, a capacity for planning and construction that challenged the very boundaries between human and animal cognition. The forest around him continued its daily symphony of sounds, birds calling, insects buzzing, wind rustling through the canopy, but Ethan barely noticed. His attention was entirely focused on the vine structure and what it represented. Every few minutes, he would take another photograph, capturing different angles, different details, building a comprehensive record of this remarkable discovery. He made sketches in his notebook, trying to understand the mechanical principles at work, how the forces were distributed, how the counterweight system functioned. The more he studied it, the more sophisticated it appeared. As the day progressed, Ethan's initial shock gave way to a deeper contemplation. If bears could build something like this, what else might they be capable of that humans simply hadn't observed? How many other examples of animal intelligence and creativity existed in the remote corners of the wilderness, unseen and undocumented? The thought was both humbling and exciting. It suggested a natural world far richer and more complex than most people imagined, filled with mysteries waiting to be discovered by those patient enough to look and lucky enough to be in the right place at the right time. The afternoon brought new activity. Other animals approached the chasm throughout the day, some showing curiosity about the vine structure, others ignoring it entirely. A family of deer picked their way along the edge, choosing to go around rather than investigate the strange construction. A pair of ravens landed on the guide rails, cawing loudly before flying away. But none of them interacted with the system the way the bears had. It was clearly their creation, their tool, designed for their specific needs. As the sun began to sink toward the western peaks, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Ethan realized he had a decision to make. He could pack up his equipment, hike back to town, and share his discovery with the world. The photographs and videos he had captured would cause a sensation in the scientific community. There would be papers published, documentaries made, experts arriving to study the site. Or he could stay. He could continue to observe, to document, to try to understand not just the how, but the why. Why had the bears built this? What was on the other side of the chasm that was so important it justified this extraordinary effort? The decision, in the end, was easy. Ethan made camp a safe distance from the cable car site, setting up his small tent in a grove of aspens where he could maintain observation while remaining unobtrusive. As darkness fell and the forest settled into its nighttime rhythms, he sat by his small camp stove, heating a simple meal while his mind continued to process the day's revelations. The stars emerged overhead, brilliant in the clear mountain air, and somewhere in the distance, an owl hooted its lonely call. That night, Ethan barely slept. Every sound in the forest made him alert, wondering if the bears might return, if he might witness more of their extraordinary behavior. He thought about the mother bear's patience with her cub, the gentle way she had coaxed it into the basket, the obvious care she had taken to ensure its safety during the crossing. There was love there, clear and unmistakable, expressed through actions that required not just instinct, but genuine understanding and forethought. It was parenting at a level that transcended species boundaries, recognizable to any human who had ever taught a child to ride a bicycle or cross a street safely. The second day dawned gray and misty, with a light drizzle that made the forest smell of earth and growth. Ethan was at his observation post before first light, his camera protected by a rain cover, his notebook wrapped in plastic. He didn't have long to wait. The mother bear and her cub returned just as the forest was beginning to wake up. But this time they weren't alone. Following behind them, moving slowly and carefully, was another cub, slightly smaller than the first. This one moved differently, favoring its right front paw, and Ethan could see even from a distance that it was thinner than it should be, its fur lacking the healthy gloss of its sibling. The mother bear's behavior with the second cub was even more remarkable than what Ethan had witnessed the day before. She was extraordinarily gentle, using her body to support the injured cub when it struggled over rough terrain. When they reached the cable car system, she went through the same patient process of encouragement, but this time with even more care. The injured cub was clearly frightened, perhaps traumatized by whatever had caused its injury, and it took nearly an hour of coaxing before it would even approach the basket. What followed was a masterclass in animal empathy. The healthy cub, who had been so reluctant the day before, now became the teacher. It climbed into the basket first, demonstrating that it was safe, then climbed out and nosed its injured sibling encouragingly. The mother bear watched this interaction with what Ethan could only describe as approval, occasionally adding her own gentle encouragement, but largely letting her healthy cub take the lead. It was a display of learning and teaching that went beyond simple mimicry, showing an understanding that the injured cub needed reassurance from a peer, not just a parent. When the injured cub finally entered the basket, the mother bear's operation of the cable car was even more careful than before. She moved slowly, smoothly, compensating for every slight sway of the basket, keeping the ride as gentle as possible. The healthy cub stayed close to her, as if understanding that its sibling needed extra support, even from across the chasm. When the basket reached the other side and the injured cub climbed out safely, the mother bear let out a sound that Ethan had never heard from a bear before, a soft, almost musical vocalization that seemed to express relief and pride simultaneously. This time, instead of going around to reunite with her cubs, the mother bear did something unexpected. She began to work on the cable car system itself, adjusting vines, tightening connections, replacing a section of worn branch with a fresh one she had dragged from the forest. It was maintenance, deliberate and systematic, the kind of regular upkeep that kept any complex system functioning. She knew exactly which parts needed attention, moving from point to point with practiced efficiency. The healthy cub watched intently from the other side, and Ethan realized it was learning, absorbing the knowledge of how to maintain this remarkable construction. As the mother bear worked, Ethan noticed something else. There were other marks on the trees near the cable car, older marks that had been partially grown over by bark. This system had been here for years, maybe even decades. It wasn't just one brilliant bear's innovation, but something that had been refined and improved over time. Each generation perhaps adding its own improvements, solving new problems, making it safer and more efficient. The implications were staggering. This wasn't just tool use or problem solving, it was culture. Technology passed down and improved upon, exactly the kind of cumulative learning that had long been thought to be uniquely human. The rain intensified as the day wore on, but Ethan remained at his post, completely absorbed in documenting every detail of the bear's behavior. He watched as they made multiple trips across the chasm throughout the day, bringing various items each time. The healthy cub carried moss and soft grasses in its mouth. The mother bear transported what looked like medicinal plants that Ethan recognized as ones with anti-inflammatory properties. They were gathering supplies, but for what purpose? What was on the other side that required such dedication? As afternoon gave way to evening, the bears made one final crossing for the day. This time, the mother bear herself climbed into a larger basket that Ethan hadn't noticed before, one reinforced with additional supports. The two cubs worked together to operate the pulley system, their coordination imperfect but improving with each attempt. They were learning not just to use the tool but to work as a team, to communicate and coordinate their efforts. When their mother reached the other side safely, both cubs let out excited vocalizations, clearly pleased with their success. The little family disappeared into the forest on the far side of the chasm as darkness began to fall, leaving Ethan alone with his thoughts and his incredible documentation. He had filled multiple memory cards with photographs and video. His notebook was crammed with observations and sketches, but he felt like he had only scratched the surface of understanding what was happening here. The injured cub, the medicinal plants, the repeated crossings, it all pointed to something more than just a clever way to cross a chasm. There was a purpose here, a goal that drove these bears to extraordinary lengths. That night, as Ethan lay in his tent listening to the rain pattering on the fabric, he thought about his own life, about the loss that had driven him into the wilderness in search of something he couldn't name. His wife would have loved this, would have been beside herself with excitement at such a discovery. She had always believed that animals were far more intelligent and emotional than most people gave them credit for, had spent hours watching the birds at their backyard feeder, making up stories about their lives and relationships. The familiar ache of grief settled in his chest, but for the first time in months it was accompanied by something else. Wonder. Purpose. The feeling that he had been led here for a reason, that documenting this incredible story was something he was meant to do. The third day brought clear skies and a decision. Ethan needed to know what was on the other side of the chasm. He couldn't use the bear's cable car, of course, but he could find another way across. He spent the morning hiking downstream, where the chasm narrowed and eventually became crossable via a series of precarious rock formations. It was dangerous, requiring all his climbing experience and equipment, but by midday, he had made it to the other side. He then carefully made his way back upstream, following game trails and his GPS until he was near the cable car's terminus on the far side. What he found there exceeded his wildest expectations and brought tears to his eyes. In a sheltered grove, protected from the elements by overhanging rocks and dense vegetation, was what could only be described as a bear hospice. An elderly bear, her fur gray with age and her body frail with illness, lay on a carefully constructed bed of moss and leaves. Around her were the supplies the mother and cubs had been bringing: food, water collected in a hollow log, the medicinal plants arranged within easy reach. But the most remarkable thing was that this elderly bear was clearly not related to the family that was caring for her. Her fur was a different color, lighter, with distinctive markings that marked her as from a different genetic line. She was also significantly larger, even in her weakened state, suggesting she might be from a different subspecies that occasionally wandered into this territory. Yet here was this mother bear and her cubs, one of them injured itself, devoting enormous effort and ingenuity to caring for a stranger. The healthy cub was curled up against the elderly bear's side, providing warmth, while the injured cub was carefully pushing berries within her reach. Ethan watched from his concealed position as the mother bear entered the grove, carrying more supplies. She approached the elderly bear with obvious familiarity, checking on her condition with gentle sniffs and soft vocalizations. The old bear responded weakly but with clear recognition, and what Ethan could only interpret as gratitude. The mother bear then did something that made Ethan have to stifle a gasp. She began to groom the elderly bear, carefully working through the matted fur, removing debris and parasites, the kind of intimate caregiving that spoke of deep compassion. As he watched this incredible scene of interspecies empathy, Ethan began to notice other details about the grove. There were worn paths suggesting regular visits over an extended period. There were storage areas where food was cached, protected from other scavengers. There were even what looked like primitive tools, rocks selected for specific purposes, sticks stripped and shaped for reaching or manipulating objects. This wasn't just a temporary arrangement but a long-term care facility, created and maintained with dedication and intelligence. The story became clearer as Ethan observed over the following days. The elderly bear had likely been injured or become ill while passing through the territory. Unable to continue her journey or care for herself, she would have died alone in the wilderness. but instead this mother bear had found her, recognized her need, and set about not just helping, but creating an entire system to provide ongoing care. The cable car wasn't built to reach a destination, but to reach an individual, to bridge not just a physical gap, but an emotional and moral one. The injured cub's role in this caregiving was particularly poignant. Despite its own challenges, it was learning that helping others was important, that compassion extended beyond one's own family or even one's own species. Ethan watched as the cub carefully demonstrated to the elderly bear how to access water from the hollow log, patiently repeating the action until the old bear understood. It was teaching, pure and simple, one injured creature helping another navigate disability. As the days passed, Ethan documented the daily routines of care. The mother bear and her cubs would make multiple trips across the cable car each day, bringing fresh food, replacing bedding, providing companionship. They had developed a schedule, with different cubs staying with the elderly bear at different times, ensuring she was never alone for long. The mother bear had even figured out a way to help the old bear to a nearby stream for water when she was strong enough, supporting her weight and guiding her carefully over the rough terrain. But it wasn't just the physical care that was remarkable. Ethan observed moments of what could only be described as emotional support. When the elderly bear showed signs of distress, making low moaning sounds, the cubs would nuzzle against her, making soft, comforting vocalizations. The mother bear would sometimes simply sit beside the old bear, their bodies touching, providing the simple comfort of presence. These were not the behaviors of animals operating on instinct alone, but of conscious beings choosing compassion. One particularly moving incident occurred on Ethan's 5th day of observation. The elderly bear had a bad night, her breathing labored and distressed. The mother bear stayed with her the entire time, occasionally raising her head to make a low, mournful sound that echoed through the forest. By morning, the crisis had passed, but the mother bear's exhaustion was evident. Her cubs took over the care duties without being prompted, showing an understanding of their mother's needs as well as those of their patient. It was during this time that Ethan noticed something else extraordinary. Other bears in the area seemed to know about this caregiving arrangement. A large male bear, typically a threat to cubs, approached the grove one day. Instead of aggression, he showed what looked like respect, leaving a salmon he had caught near the entrance before departing without entering. A younger female bear brought berries. It was as if the entire local bear population recognized and supported what was happening here, contributing to the care of the elderly stranger. The cable car system took on new meaning in this context. It wasn't just a tool, but a lifeline, a bridge of compassion that allowed the bears to provide consistent care despite the geographic barrier. The engineering marvel that had first caught Ethan's attention was actually secondary to the emotional and moral marvel it represented. These bears had identified a problem, the inability to regularly reach and care for someone in need, and had solved it through innovation and persistent effort. As Ethan continued his observations, he began to notice changes in the elderly bear's condition. The regular care, nutrition, and medication from the plants seemed to be helping. She was growing stronger, more alert. One day, she even managed to stand on her own, taking a few shaky steps before needing to rest. The joy displayed by the cubs at this small victory was unmistakable. They bounded around her, making excited vocalizations, their body language expressing pure celebration. The injured cub's recovery paralleled that of the elderly bear. The regular movement and activity involved in the caregiving seemed to be helping its rehabilitation. Its limp became less pronounced, its confidence grew. Ethan realized that in caring for another, the cub was also healing itself, both physically and perhaps emotionally. There was a lesson there that transcended species, about how helping others can help ourselves, about how compassion can be its own form of medicine. One morning, Ethan made a discovery that changed his understanding of the entire situation once again. Hidden in the rocks near the elderly bear's grove, partially covered by years of accumulated forest debris, were the remains of an old bear skeleton. But intertwined with these remains were the remnants of an older cable car system, cruder than the current one but recognizable in its basic design. The implications hit him like a physical blow. This wasn't the first time bears had built such a system to care for someone. This was a tradition, a practice passed down through generations. He carefully documented the old remains, noting how the construction techniques had evolved, how the current system showed improvements and refinements over the older version. It was technological progress in its purest form, each generation building on the knowledge of the previous one. The mother bear hadn't invented the cable car. She had inherited the knowledge and improved upon it. Her cubs would carry this knowledge forward, perhaps adding their own innovations when the time came. The weather turned cold as Ethan's second week of observation began, the first hints of winter touching the mountain peaks with snow. The bears' activity increased, their preparations taking on new urgency. They were stockpiling food in the grove, creating a larger cache than before. The mother bear brought different plants now, ones Ethan recognized as having properties that would help with cold weather ailments. They were preparing for winter but not abandoning their charge. The cable car system received extensive maintenance during this time. The mother bear taught her cubs how to replace worn vines before they failed, how to test the weight-bearing capacity of different components, how to adjust tensions to account for weather-related changes in the materials. It was vocational education, apprenticeship in its most fundamental form. The cubs paid careful attention, sometimes practicing the techniques on smaller, non-critical parts of the system. One particularly cold morning, Ethan witnessed something that would stay with him forever. The elderly bear was struggling with the cold, her aged body unable to maintain proper temperature. The mother bear and her cubs worked together to build what could only be described as a shelter around her, weaving branches and packing mud to create walls that would block the wind. They brought extra bedding, dried grasses and leaves they had been collecting for days. Then all three of them curled up around the elderly bear, sharing their body heat through the cold night. Ethan, watching from his own cold and uncomfortable hiding spot, found tears freezing on his cheeks. The pure selflessness of what he was witnessing. The dedication to caring for someone who could offer nothing in return. Challenged every assumption about the natural world being driven solely by survival and self-interest. These bears were choosing compassion over comfort, other over self, in ways that many humans would struggle to match. As the days grew shorter and colder, Ethan knew his time was running out. He couldn't survive a winter in these conditions, and soon the weather would make the journey back to civilization dangerous, if not impossible. But he found it almost impossible to leave, to stop documenting this incredible story. Every day brought new observations, new understanding of the depth of intelligence and emotion these bears possessed. He had enough evidence to revolutionize the understanding of bear cognition and behavior. But more than that, he had witnessed something that transcended scientific discovery. The last day of observation before Ethan had to leave brought an unexpected development. The elderly bear, now notably stronger than when he had first seen her, made her first unassisted journey to the stream. She moved slowly, carefully, but under her own power. The cubs flanked her, ready to provide support if needed, while the mother bear watched from a short distance, allowing the old bear her dignity while remaining ready to help. When the elderly bear reached the stream and drank deeply, the celebration from the bear family was joyous but restrained, as if they understood the importance of the moment. That evening, as Ethan prepared for his departure the next morning, he watched the bears make their evening crossing on the cable car. The system that had seemed so impossible when he first discovered it now seemed almost natural, an extension of the bear's remarkable capacity for problem-solving and compassion. The mother bear went last, and as she reached the other side, she paused and looked back across the chasm. For a moment, Ethan could have sworn she was looking directly at him again, acknowledging his presence one last time. He spent his last night in the forest unable to sleep, his mind racing with everything he had witnessed. The scientific implications were staggering, but it was the emotional and philosophical implications that kept him awake. If bears could show this level of compassion, intelligence, and culture, what did that mean for how humans should interact with the natural world? How many other species possessed capabilities that humans had simply never observed or acknowledged? The humility he felt was profound, mixed with a sense of privilege at having witnessed something so extraordinary. As dawn broke on his final day, Ethan took one last series of photographs of the cable car system, the engineering marvel that had led him to an even greater marvel of empathy and intelligence. He carefully packed his equipment, his memory cards and notebooks containing documentation that would change how the world understood bears. But as he prepared to leave, he made a decision. He would share the story, but not the location. This place, these bears, deserved protection from the curiosity and interference that would inevitably follow such a discovery. The hike back to civilization took 2 days, and with each step away from the cable car and the bears, Ethan felt like he was leaving a piece of himself behind. But he also carried something new with him, a renewed sense of wonder, a deeper understanding of the connections that bind all living things, and a story that needed to be told, even if no one would believe it at first. The mother bear and her cubs had built more than a cable car. They had built a bridge between worlds, showing that compassion, intelligence, and love were not uniquely human traits, but threads in the larger tapestry of life. As he reached the trailhead where he had parked his truck weeks earlier, Ethan turned back one last time toward the mountains. Somewhere up there, a mother bear and her cubs were caring for an elderly stranger, using tools they had built and knowledge they had inherited, demonstrating a level of compassion that put many human endeavors to shame. The cable car creaked in the wind, a testament to innovation born from love, and the bears continued their daily routine of care, unaware that their story would soon inspire thousands, perhaps millions, to see the natural world with new eyes. The drive back to town was quiet, Ethan's mind still processing everything he had witnessed. The photos on his camera seemed almost unreal, like something from a fantasy rather than documentation of actual events. But the emotion they captured was undeniably real, the love between mother and cubs, the gentle care for the elderly bear, the incredible intelligence behind the cable car's construction. As he reached the first signs of civilization, gas stations and convenience stores, the human world seemed suddenly strange, disconnected from the deeper truths he had witnessed in the forest. That night, in a motel room that felt suffocatingly artificial after weeks in the wilderness, Ethan began to write. Not the scientific paper that would come later, but the story, the full emotional truth of what he had witnessed. He wrote about the mother bear's patience, the cub's learning, the elderly bear's dignity in receiving care. He wrote about the cable car not as a curiosity but as a symbol of how innovation and compassion could work together. He wrote until his eyes burned and his fingers cramped, trying to capture even a fraction of the magic he had witnessed. The story spread slowly at first, shared among wildlife enthusiasts and researchers who were skeptical but intrigued. The photographs were analyzed, scrutinized for signs of manipulation, but they held up to every test. Videos showed the bears operating the cable car system in real time, impossible to fake. Gradually, the scientific community began to take notice. Papers were written, conferences were organized, and the understanding of bear intelligence was fundamentally revised. But more importantly, the story touched hearts around the world. Children drew pictures of the mother bear and her cable car. Teachers used it as an example of problem-solving and empathy. Conservation groups saw increased support as people began to understand that protecting wilderness meant protecting not just animals but complex cultures and intelligences we were only beginning to understand. The elderly bear, recovering through the compassion of strangers, became a symbol of how care and community could transcend all boundaries. Ethan returned to the mountains the following spring, not to the exact location of the cable car, which he kept secret, but to the general area. He set up hidden cameras in various locations, hoping to capture more evidence of extraordinary bear behavior. What he found exceeded his hopes. The cable car system had been expanded, improved. There were now 2 baskets of different sizes, and the pulley system had been refined with what looked like a primitive brake mechanism. The elderly bear, fully recovered, was now helping to operate the system, teaching a new generation of cubs the skills she had learned. The injured cub from the previous year had fully healed and was now one of the most active participants in maintaining and operating the cable car. It had become something of an engineer, often spending time adjusting and improving various components. Its sibling had taken on more of a caretaker role, showing particular skill in identifying and gathering medicinal plants. The mother bear supervised it all with what Ethan could only describe as pride, watching her cubs carry forward the tradition of compassion and innovation. But perhaps the most remarkable discovery came when Ethan found evidence of multiple cable car systems throughout the region. The technology was spreading, being adapted to different locations and needs. Bears were teaching bears. Innovation was spreading through observation and learning. Culture was being transmitted and evolved. It was nothing less than a technological revolution in the bear community, driven not by survival necessity but by the desire to help others, to overcome obstacles that prevented care and community. The implications for conservation were profound. These forests weren't just habitats but libraries of knowledge, universities of learning that had developed over generations. Every old-growth tree might anchor not just a cable car, but centuries of accumulated wisdom. Every elderly bear might be a repository of knowledge, every cub a potential innovator. The argument for protecting wilderness areas became not just about preserving nature but about protecting non-human cultures that we were only beginning to discover and understand. Ethan's documentation eventually filled books, inspired documentaries, and changed how millions of people saw the natural world. But for him, it always came back to that first moment of discovery, standing in the misty forest, hearing the creak of vines and branches, and realizing he was witnessing something extraordinary. The mother bear, who had built a cable car to help her cub reach a sick grandmother, had revealed something fundamental about the nature of a consciousness, compassion, and intelligence that transcended species boundaries. Years later, when asked about his discovery in interviews, Ethan would always emphasize that he hadn't discovered the bear's intelligence and compassion. He had simply been privileged to witness it. It had always been there, hidden in the remote corners of wilderness, waiting not to be discovered but to be recognized. The bears had been building cable cars, caring for their elderly, teaching their young, and innovating solutions to problems long before any human had noticed. We hadn't given them these capabilities by observing them. We had simply finally opened our eyes to what had always been there. The story of the mother bear and her cable car became a touchstone for a new era of wildlife research and conservation. One that recognized animals not as subjects to be studied, but as individuals and cultures to be respected and protected. It sparked a revolution in how we understand animal intelligence, leading to discoveries of similar incredible behaviors in species around the world. But more than that, it reminded humanity that compassion, innovation, and love were not our exclusive domain, but part of the larger tapestry of life on Earth. In his final book on the subject, published decades after that first discovery, Ethan wrote, "The mother bear didn't build that cable car to impress us or to prove bears were intelligent. She built it because someone needed help, and she had the ability to provide it. In that simple truth lies a lesson for us all. Intelligence without compassion is merely clever, but intelligence driven by love that can move mountains, span chasms, and build bridges, not just of vine and branch, but of understanding and connection. The bears taught me that we are not alone in our capacity to care, to innovate, to sacrifice for others. We are part of a world far richer in consciousness and compassion than we ever dared imagine." The cable car still creaks in the wind somewhere in those remote mountains, maintained now by new generations of bears who inherited both the knowledge of its construction and the wisdom of its purpose. And sometimes, if you know where to look and are patient enough to wait, you can still see them. A mother and her cubs, carefully operating their remarkable invention, bringing food and medicine to someone in need, proving with every crossing that love and intelligence know no boundaries, that compassion is the thread that connects all conscious beings, and that the natural world holds wonders we are only beginning to understand. The morning after Ethan's departure, the forest seemed to hold its breath in anticipation of what was to come. The mother bear emerged from the tree line with her cubs, but something was different about their movement today, something more purposeful, more determined than their usual morning routine. They approached the cable car system, but instead of preparing for their regular crossing, the mother bear began a careful inspection of the entire structure, running her paws along the vines, testing each connection with a thoroughness that spoke of preparation for something significant. The cubs watched attentively, and the injured one, now moving with only the slightest hint of its former limp, began to help, mimicking its mother's actions with growing confidence. What Ethan didn't know, what he couldn't have known as he made his way back to civilization with his precious documentation, was that his presence had been more than just noticed by the bears. It had been accepted, integrated into their understanding of their world in a way that would have amazed him even more than what he had already witnessed. The mother bear had recognized in him something familiar, the same drive to observe, to understand, to document that she herself possessed. For she too was a keeper of knowledge, a chronicler of her kind's history in her own way, and she had seen in Ethan's patient observation a kindred spirit, someone who understood that some things were more important than immediate survival or comfort. The preparation at the cable car continued for hours, with the mother bear bringing new materials from the forest, selecting each vine and branch with extraordinary care. She was building something new, an addition to the existing system that required even more precise engineering than the original construction. The cubs helped where they could, but mostly they watched, learning not just the how but the why of what their mother was doing. She would pause occasionally to show them specific techniques, how to test a vine's strength without damaging it, how to weave branches in a pattern that distributed weight evenly, how to create joints that could flex without breaking. As the sun climbed higher, warming the forest floor and burning away the morning mist, other bears began to arrive. First came the large male who had previously brought the salmon, his massive frame moving with surprising grace through the underbrush. Then the younger female who had contributed berries, followed by several others Ethan had never seen during his observations. They didn't approach immediately, but settled at respectful distances around the clearing, watching the mother bear work with what could only be described as anticipation. It was a gathering, purposeful and organized, unlike anything in the scientific literature about bear behavior. The mother bear acknowledged each arrival with a glance and a soft vocalization, but she didn't stop her work. She was creating what appeared to be a second track alongside the original cable car line, but this one was different, more elaborate, with multiple stopping points along its length. The engineering was more complex, incorporating what looked like switching mechanisms that would allow the basket to change tracks mid-journey. It was an evolution of the original design, more ambitious and sophisticated, requiring an even deeper understanding of mechanical principles. As afternoon approached, the elderly bear made her appearance, moving slowly but steadily from her grove on the far side of the chasm. Her recovery had been remarkable, her fur now glossier, her movements more confident, though she still showed the careful deliberation of age. She approached the cable car's far terminal and made a series of vocalizations that carried across the chasm, sounds that had a ritualistic quality to them, as if she was announcing something important. The gathered bears responded with their own calls, creating a chorus that echoed through the valley. A sound that would have sent shivers down Ethan's spine had he been there to hear it. What happened next was a ceremony of sorts, though calling it that might impose too human an interpretation on what was essentially a bear cultural event. The elderly bear began to work on the far side of the new cable line, her movements careful but skilled, showing that she too possessed the knowledge of construction. She was building the receiving end of the new system, working in coordination with the mother bear despite the chasm between them. They couldn't see each other's detailed work, yet somehow their constructions aligned perfectly, suggesting a shared understanding of the design that went beyond mere imitation. The cubs were given specific tasks during this construction, and their roles revealed something profound about bear education and knowledge transfer. The formerly injured cub was tasked with sorting materials, grouping vines by thickness and flexibility, branches by strength and shape. It showed an understanding of categorization and properties that suggested abstract thinking. Its sibling was responsible for testing connections, applying weight and pressure to ensure safety, showing an understanding of quality control and risk assessment. These weren't random assignments, but carefully chosen educational opportunities, each cub learning aspects of the construction that matched their apparent aptitudes and interests. As the sun began to sink toward the western peaks, the new addition to the cable car system was nearly complete. It consisted of not just one, but 3 interconnected lines, allowing for multiple baskets to operate simultaneously. The switching mechanisms meant that baskets could be routed to different destinations on either side of the chasm. It was a transportation network rather than a simple point-to-point connection, showing a level of planning and foresight that suggested the bears were preparing for increased use of the system. The purpose of this expansion became clear as darkness began to fall. The gathered bears began to form a line on both sides of the chasm, and one by one they began to cross using the cable car system. But this wasn't random use, it was organized, purposeful. Each bear brought something with them: food, nesting materials, medicinal plants, even stones selected for unknown purposes. They were creating supply caches on both sides of the chasm, preparing for something that required resources to be available regardless of which side they might find themselves on. The mother bear supervised this operation with remarkable efficiency, directing traffic, ensuring the system wasn't overloaded, making minor adjustments as needed. Her cubs assisted, learning not just to operate the system but to manage it, to coordinate multiple users, to prioritize crossings based on urgency or cargo. It was logistics management at a level that many humans would struggle to achieve without technology and communication tools. Yet these bears were accomplishing it through a combination of vocalizations, body language, and shared understanding. As the operation continued into the night, illuminated by a full moon that cast silver light through the forest canopy, patterns began to emerge. The bears were creating a network of support that extended beyond just the elderly bear's care. They were establishing what could only be described as a community resource system, where materials and knowledge could be shared across the geographic barrier of the chasm. Young bears were being taught to operate the system by older ones, knowledge spreading through the population in real time. The elderly bear, despite her age and recent recovery, took on a teaching role that revealed her true value to the community. She demonstrated techniques for preserving food that the younger bears didn't know, methods of treating injuries using plant combinations that weren't part of the common knowledge. She was a library of accumulated wisdom, and her rescue and recovery had preserved not just a life, but generations of learning. The younger bears watched her with rapt attention, absorbing knowledge that might otherwise have been lost. One particularly remarkable moment occurred when a very young cub, probably only a few months old and belonging to the younger female bear, became frightened during its first cable car crossing. The basket stopped midway across the chasm, swaying gently, and the cub's terrified cries echoed through the night. Without hesitation, the formerly injured cub climbed into another basket on the new parallel line and had its mother send it out to stop alongside the frightened youngster. What followed was a lesson in empathy and courage, as the older cub gently encouraged the younger one, showing by example that the journey was safe, even making what appeared to be playful gestures to distract from the fear. This interaction revealed something profound about how bear culture was transmitted. It wasn't just through parent-to-offspring teaching, but through peer learning, community support, and shared experience. The formerly injured cub, who had once been the frightened one needing encouragement, was now the teacher, passing on not just knowledge, but emotional support. It was a cycle of learning and teaching that created resilient, knowledgeable communities capable of innovation and adaptation. As dawn approached, the bears began to disperse, but not before engaging in what could only be described as a celebration. They had completed the expansion of the cable car system, successfully tested it with multiple users, and established new supply caches and teaching protocols. The vocalizations they exchanged had a different quality from normal bear communication, more varied, more musical, suggesting a complexity of expression that went beyond basic needs and warnings. It was social communication, the building and reinforcing of community bonds through shared accomplishment. The mother bear and her cubs were the last to leave the immediate area of the cable car, but before they did, the mother performed one final action that would have brought Ethan to tears had he witnessed it. She approached the tree where he had hidden during his first observations, where his scent still lingered faintly, and she left something there, a small pile of the medicinal plants she had been gathering, arranged deliberately. It was an acknowledgement, perhaps even a gift, left for the human who had watched them with respect and had not interfered with their work. In the days that followed, the expanded cable car system became a hub of activity. Bears from territories that had previously been isolated by the chasm could now interact, share resources, and most importantly, share knowledge. Young bears from one side learned foraging techniques specific to the other side's terrain. Mothers shared cub-rearing strategies. Older bears passed on weather prediction methods and seasonal preparation techniques. The cable car had become more than a transportation system. It was a bridge between communities, a facilitator of cultural exchange. The formerly injured cub showed particular aptitude for innovation, constantly tinkering with the system, making small improvements. It figured out how to create a braking system using twisted vines that increased friction, allowing for more controlled descents. It developed a call system, different vocalizations that indicated whether a basket was empty, carrying bears, or carrying supplies, allowing for better coordination. These innovations were quickly adopted by others, showing how technological advancement could spread through the bear community. Its sibling, meanwhile, became something of a medical specialist, learning from both its mother and the elderly bear about plant medicines and treatment techniques. It began maintaining what could only be described as a pharmacy, a collection of medicinal plants sorted by property and use, dried and stored in a cave near the cable car system. Other bears began coming to this young bear for treatment of injuries and illnesses, recognizing its expertise despite its youth. Knowledge was becoming specialized, allowing for greater efficiency and effectiveness in the community. The elderly bear's strength continued to improve, and with it came revelations about her past that explained much about the cable car system's origins. Through her interactions with the other bears, patterns emerged that suggested she had been one of the original builders of an earlier version of the system, perhaps decades ago. Her knowledge of construction techniques, her familiarity with the engineering principles, her ability to teach complex concepts, all pointed to her being a master builder, a keeper of technological knowledge that had been passed down through generations. One day, she led several younger bears to a different part of the forest, a journey that took most of the morning. What she showed them there changed everything. Hidden beneath years of overgrowth were the remains of not one, but several old cable car systems, some so ancient that only the marks on the trees remained. This wasn't an isolated innovation, but a tradition going back, perhaps, centuries. The bears had been building these systems wherever the need arose, wherever geography separated communities or resources. It was a technological culture hidden in plain sight, invisible to humans who had never thought to look for it. The implications were staggering. If bears had been building and maintaining complex transportation systems for generations, what other technologies might they have developed? The younger bears explored these old sites with intense curiosity, learning from the successes and failures of previous generations. They could see where designs had been improved, where mistakes had been made and corrected, where innovations had been tried and either adopted or abandoned. It was an archaeological record of bear engineering, preserved in vine and branch and bark. The mother bear's cubs were particularly fascinated by one ancient system that had incorporated what appeared to be a shelter at its midpoint, a covered platform where bears could rest during longer crossings. They spent days studying its construction, understanding how the builders had distributed the additional weight, how they had waterproofed the covering using mud and leaves. Within a week, they had begun construction of a similar shelter on their own system, improving on the ancient design with their own innovations. This learning from the past while innovating for the future showed a sophisticated understanding of progress and development. The bears weren't just maintaining traditions but actively improving upon them, each generation adding to the accumulated knowledge. The cable car system Ethan had discovered was just the latest iteration in a long history of bear engineering, and it wouldn't be the last. Already, the cubs were sketching out plans, if bears could be said to plan, for future expansions and improvements. The social implications of the cable car system became increasingly apparent as the seasons changed. During the salmon run, bears from both sides of the chasm could access the best fishing spots, sharing the bounty rather than competing for limited resources. When a forest fire threatened one side of the chasm, families could evacuate quickly to safety. When a particularly harsh winter left one area with scarce food, Supplies could be transported from areas of abundance. The cable car had transformed the bears' relationship with their environment, allowing them to overcome natural barriers that had previously limited their communities. The formerly injured cub, now fully healed and growing rapidly, began working on something new. It had observed how much effort was required to operate the manual pulley system, and was experimenting with ways to reduce the necessary force. It discovered that by using a series of smaller pulleys rather than single large ones, the mechanical advantage could be increased significantly. This innovation required more complex construction, but resulted in a system that even the smallest cubs could operate. It was an understanding of mechanical advantage that human children typically don't grasp until formal education. Yet this bear had discovered it through observation and experimentation. The teaching methods employed by the adult bears were remarkably sophisticated. They used what educators would recognize as scaffolding, providing support for learning that was gradually removed as competence increased. They demonstrated, then guided, then observed, intervening only when necessary. They allowed cubs to make mistakes in safe situations, understanding that failure was part of learning. They celebrated successes without creating competition, fostering a collaborative rather than competitive learning environment. The elderly bear's role as a master teacher became more pronounced as her health continued to improve. She would gather groups of younger bears and demonstrate techniques that seemed almost impossibly complex. She showed them how to select vines based not just on current strength, but on how they would age, choosing materials that would become stronger over time rather than weaker. She taught them to read weather patterns and adjust the cable car's tension accordingly, preventing damage from storms. She passed on knowledge about which trees were best for anchoring, which would grow stronger over time and which would eventually weaken. One of her most remarkable lessons involved teaching the bears to plan for multiple generations ahead. She showed them how to plant certain trees in strategic locations that wouldn't be useful for decades, but would eventually provide perfect anchor points for future expansions. She taught them to create redundancies in the system, backup lines, and alternative routes that might never be used but would be crucial in emergencies. This long-term thinking, planning for futures they might never see, showed a level of abstract reasoning and community commitment that challenged every assumption about animal cognition. The mother bear's cubs had become adolescents by this time, nearly as large as their mother and increasingly independent. Yet they continued to work on the cable car system, not out of necessity but out of what appeared to be genuine interest and commitment to their community. The formerly injured cub had become the primary maintenance supervisor, checking the system daily, making repairs and improvements. Its sibling had established what amounted to a medical station near the cable car, treating injuries that occurred during construction or operation. The specialization of roles within the bear community around the cable car system was remarkable. Some bears became expert operators, able to manage multiple baskets simultaneously with impressive coordination. Others specialized in maintenance, developing an intimate knowledge of every vine and branch in the system. Still others focused on innovation, constantly experimenting with new designs and improvements. There were teachers who specialized in training cubs, supply managers who organized the movement of resources, even what could be described as safety inspectors who ensured all modifications met certain standards. This division of labor, impossible without the communication and cooperation facilitated by the cable car system, had transformed a group of solitary or small family units into a genuine community. Bears who would normally interact only during mating season or at concentrated food sources were now working together daily, sharing knowledge and resources, caring for each other's young and elderly. The cable car hadn't just bridged a physical chasm, but had created connections that were transforming bear society in fundamental ways. The discovery of the historical cable car sites had inspired what could only be described as a renaissance of bear engineering. Young bears visited the old sites like students visiting museums, learning from the past and imagining the future. They experimented with designs that had been abandoned, trying to understand why they had failed and whether modern techniques could make them work. They combined elements from different historical systems, creating hybrid designs that incorporated the best features of each. One particularly innovative young bear, a friend of the formerly injured cub, developed a communication system using hollow logs positioned at regular intervals along the cable car line. By tapping on these logs in specific patterns, bears could send messages along the entire length of the system, coordinating operations without visual contact. It was a primitive but effective form of telecommunication, allowing for much more efficient operation of the increasingly complex transportation network. The seasons turned, and with them came new challenges that tested the bears' engineering skills and community cohesion. A particularly severe storm damaged significant portions of the cable car system, requiring not just repairs, but redesign of certain sections to better withstand future storms. The entire community mobilized for the reconstruction, with even the youngest cubs contributing by gathering materials. The elderly bear directed operations from the ground, her experience invaluable in understanding which temporary fixes would hold and which required complete rebuilding. During the reconstruction, innovations emerged from necessity. The bears developed new joining techniques that allowed for more flexibility during high winds. They created breakaway sections that would fail safely rather than bringing down the entire system. They incorporated living trees into the design, selecting young, flexible trees that would grow stronger over time, becoming more integral to the system as they matured. It was biomimicry in reverse, technology incorporating and working with natural growth rather than replacing it. The formerly injured cub, now a strong young adult, made a discovery that would revolutionize bear construction techniques. It found that certain beetles, attracted to specific types of sap, would bore holes in wood in predictable patterns. By applying sap strategically, the bears could essentially guide the beetles to create perforations that made the wood easier to shape and join. It was tool use at a level of sophistication that involved not just using objects, but manipulating other organisms to achieve desired outcomes. The young bear taught this technique to others, and soon beetles were being incorporated into construction projects throughout the system. The medical knowledge being accumulated at the cable car site was equally impressive. The bears had developed treatments for various ailments using combinations of plants, minerals, and even certain insects. They had learned to set broken bones using splints made from branches and secured with vine. They practiced preventive care, regularly checking each other for parasites and injuries. The young bear who had specialized in medicine had developed a diagnostic method, using scent and visual cues to identify illnesses before they became severe. One touching incident involved a pregnant female who developed complications late in her term. The medical specialist bear worked with the elderly bear and the mother bear to create a treatment plan that involved specific plants known to ease delivery. They created a comfortable birthing den near the cable car system where the pregnant female could be monitored and supported. When she successfully delivered healthy twins, the entire community celebrated, understanding that their collaborative care had made the difference between tragedy and triumph. The cubs, now fully grown but still learning, had begun to take on teaching roles themselves. They worked with younger cubs from other families, passing on the knowledge they had accumulated. The formerly injured bear showed particular patience with cubs who struggled with the physical demands of operating the cable car, perhaps remembering its own challenges. It developed exercises and practice routines that built strength and coordination gradually, allowing even the smallest cubs to contribute meaningfully to the system's operation. Its sibling had expanded the medical facilities to include what could only be described as a rehabilitation center. Bears recovering from injuries or illness could stay in specially constructed dens near the cable car, receiving regular care while still being part of the community. The center became a hub for knowledge exchange, as recovering bears from different territories shared their own medical knowledge and practices. Traditional treatments from distant regions were tested and incorporated into the growing medical repertoire. The cable car system itself had evolved far beyond its original design. It now included multiple lines at different heights, allowing for simultaneous transport in multiple directions. There were express lines for urgent transport and slower lines for heavy cargo. The switching system had become sophisticated enough to route baskets to specific destinations without manual intervention at each junction. It was a transportation network that would be impressive if built by humans with modern tools, but it had been created entirely by bears using only natural materials and their own strength and intelligence. The impact on the broader ecosystem was noticeable. The concentration of bear activity around the cable car had created new habitats for other species. Birds nested in the superstructure, taking advantage of the protection it offered. Small mammals used the bear trails that had developed around the system. Even plants had adapted, with certain vines growing specifically along the cable car lines, strengthening them while benefiting from the regular disturbance that prevented other plants from competing. The bears had become ecosystem engineers, their technology creating new niches for other organisms. The knowledge being accumulated and transmitted through the bear community was creating what could only be described as a golden age of bear culture. Young bears were learning not just survival skills but engineering, medicine, logistics, and communication. They were developing abstract thinking abilities through problem-solving and planning. They were learning to work cooperatively on projects that benefited the entire community, rather than just themselves or their immediate family. The cable car system had become a catalyst for cognitive and social evolution. As winter approached once again, the bears prepared with an efficiency that showed how much their community had developed. Food stores were distributed strategically on both sides of the chasm. Medical supplies were stockpiled. The cable car system was reinforced and winterized. Emergency protocols were established and practiced. It was community preparation at a level that many human communities would struggle to match. Every bear knew their role, their responsibilities, and how their actions contributed to the survival and well-being of the whole. The elderly bear, now restored to health but showing her age in slower movements and longer rests, had taken on an almost mystical status in the community. She was the keeper of history, the repository of ancient knowledge, the link to generations of bears who had built and maintained these systems. Younger bears would sit with her for hours, listening to what humans might call stories but were really oral histories, accounts of past challenges and how they were overcome, of innovations that succeeded and those that failed, of bears who had contributed to the accumulated knowledge. One evening, as snow began to fall and the bears made final preparations for winter, the elderly bear did something unprecedented. She gathered several of the most promising young engineers, including both of the mother bear's now adult cubs, and led them to a site none of them had seen before. Hidden deep in a cave, protected from the elements, were what could only be described as artifacts. Pieces of ancient cable car systems, preserved examples of different construction techniques, even what appeared to be practice models where young bears from generations past had learned their craft. It was a museum, a teaching laboratory, a library of physical objects that contained centuries of accumulated knowledge. The young bears explored with awe, understanding that they were being entrusted with something precious, the continuation of a tradition that stretched back further than any of them had imagined. They studied the artifacts carefully, learning from the successes and failures of their ancestors, understanding that they were part of something larger than themselves, a continuous chain of innovation and knowledge transfer. The formerly injured cub, now a master engineer in its own right, made a connection between different historical designs that led to a breakthrough. It realized that certain failed designs from the past could work if combined with modern techniques its generation had developed. Within days, it had begun construction of a prototype that incorporated ancient wisdom with contemporary innovation. The result was a cable car system that required less maintenance, operated more smoothly, and could carry heavier loads than anything built before.